Good afternoon, Mr. Wu. Deputy Commissioner Jiang. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the public lecture by Mr. Wu Hongbo. My name is Hugo Chu, Year 4 student of the Engineering and Business Administration double degree program of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, we're greatly honored to have invited Mr. Wu Hongbo, Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, to visit our university and to deliver a lecture. First of all, may I have the honor to invite Professor Fok Tai Fai, our Pro-Vice-Chancellor, to deliver a welcoming address and introduce our speaker. Professor Fok, please.
Mr. Wu, Deputy Commissioner Jiang, distinguished guests, colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Today we are very honored to have Mr. Wu Hongbo, Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, here to deliver a lecture. On behalf of the Chinese University of Hong Kong and our fellow co-organizers, namely Beijing Hong Kong Academic Exchange Center, the Society of Hong Kong Scholars, and the Joint Committee of Mainland Student and Scholar Associations, I would like to extend to you all a very warm welcome. Mr. Wu Hongbo was appointed United Nations Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs in 2012. A career diplomat, Mr. Wu has served as ambassador of the People's Republic of China to a number of countries, including the Federal Republic of Germany, New Zealand, and the Philippines. From 2006 to 2009, he served as Director General and later Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. Mr. Wu not only has his vision in the international arena, he is an expert in Hong Kong affairs. He has engaged in issues related to Hong Kong for a number of years. He had served as Director and Director General of the Department of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan Affairs of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and Counselor and later Chief Representative of Sino-British Joint Liaison Group. Mr. Wu was extensively involved in multicultural consultations, negotiations, and conferences on a range of economic and social issues. He was a leading official responsible for handling Hong Kong SAR's ties with over 30 international organizations and the continued application of over 200 international conventions in Hong Kong SAR. Mr. Wu brings to the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, or DESA, of the United Nations his outstanding coordination and negotiation skills, as well as rich and extensive experience with multilateral organizations and international conferences. The work of the UN reaches every corner of the globe. Although best known for peacekeeping, conflict prevention, and humanitarian assistance, there are many other ways the UN affect our lives and make the world a better place. The UN works on a broad range of fundamental issues, from sustainable development, disaster relief, counterterrorism, to promoting democracy, human rights, gender equality, and the advancement of women, economic and social development, and international health, expanding food production, and more, in order to achieve its goals for a safer world for this and future generations. The topic of Mr. Wu's talk is youth and the work of the United Nations. The work of the UN fascinates not just youth, but also people like myself who are young at heart. I'm sure you're all anxious to know more about the UN and how the organization relates to our lives. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Wu Hongbo.
Thank you very much, Professor Falk, Vice President of Chinese University of Hong Kong, dear professors, dear young friends, ladies and gentlemen. Hong Kong is really in my heart, is a city with a special place. As your Vice President was saying, I started the consultations and involvement in the negotiations leading to the return of Hong Kong from 1983. It's a time when I think quite a few were not around. That's a long time ago, it seems. And from 1983 to year 2000, I was involved in the negotiations with the British on the return of Hong Kong, 17 years together. So on day one, the 1st of January the year 2000, I was responsible to close the door of the Chinese representative office to the Sino-British Joint Liaison Group, and it sent the shortest telegram in my entire diplomatic career, reporting to Beijing that I've accomplished our mission. My office has been closed as from today. What a joyful thing to do that. Well, dear friends, let me say a few words about United Nations, and I will be very happy to answer your questions. Before that, I will say there are 6 working languages in the United Nations. I'm going to use 2. First, I will deliver my statement or my speech in English. Then I'll be ready to answer your questions either in Chinese or in English, as you wish. Now I'm going to focus on my talks today on the critical role of social development in the promotion of equality in opportunities, notably with regard to employment, education, participation, and more generally, the realization of one's potential and aspirations. The essential role of social development in advancing a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world is rooted in the founding of United Nations. The UN Charter, right on its opening page, pledges to employ international institutions for the social and the economic advancement of all peoples. Heads of states and of governments deepened their commitment to social development at the World Summit for Social Development held in 1995 in Copenhagen. Never before had so many world leaders joined together in solidarity to set a shared agenda, one that commits to improving the situation of the world's people, particularly the poorest and the marginalized. 5 years later, in the year 2000, building on commitments made at the Social Summit, governments endorsed the Millennium Development Goals, known as MDGs, or in Chinese, 千年发展目标. These goals have galvanized global and national actions towards eradicating poverty, improving education and health, and addressing challenges to the global environment. Over the past decade, the Millennium Development Goals have made huge impact in the lives of millions of people. In fact, the world has already met its target of cutting in half the extent of extreme poverty and of people without access to safe drinking water. In addition, the attendance of girls in primary schools is now equal to that of boys at the global level, and 10 years ahead of schedule. The lives of 100 million slum dwellers have benefited from enhanced efforts, and the progress in improving child survival has accelerated. Despite all these successes, levels of inequalities are holding back many of the advances made in the MDG targets. For instance, inequalities are especially high in access to improved sanitation facilities. As we know, in some countries, millions of people do not have access to decent toilets. Low coverage occurs mostly in the poorest countries and overwhelmingly in rural areas, where women face added hazard and burdens. In some areas, young girls cannot go to schools because of lack of basic sanitation facilities at school. We, as a society, also face enormous challenges in addressing the threat of climate change, which knows no bounds. It batters forests, fisheries, and biodiversity, and threatens the lives and the livelihood of millions, in particular in small island developing states. As we are approaching the 2015 deadline to achieve these Millennium Development Goals, the United Nations is working very hard to develop a framework that will take us beyond 2015. The many stakeholders involved in these discussions agreed that the new development agenda must address emerging challenges in the three pillars that make up sustainable development. Social development is one of the three, together with economic growth and the environmental protection. All three pillars, social, economic, and environmental, must be equally strong in order to help each other to survive. If one pillar is too weak, the others will eventually collapse. This was made evident in the outcome document of the most recent United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, which was held in Rio de Janeiro. The document is called The Future We Want. So why are we trying to do this? Let me share with you some information. Do you know how many people we have on the world today? 7 billion. Okay? You know how many people in the world today are suffering from hunger? The figure is 920 million, close to 1 billion people. Do you know how many people died of hunger every minute? 16 people every minute in the world died of hunger, of which 12 are children. Let me give you another information. We are talking about the food. We know many people are complaining that they are overnourished, a little bit too fat. They are not worried about food. However, if we are considering 920 million people are suffering from shortage of food, then you will look around to see where we can get the food for them. My statistics telling me the food we produce every year in the world, 1/3 is wasted. The poorest place on earth is sub-Saharan area in Africa. Most of the least developing countries are there. Do you know how many food they produce every year? They produce 230 million tons of food every year. Remember this figure. Do you know how much food wasted in the developed countries? 220 million tons. Some scientists were telling us by the year 2050, we may have in this world 9 billion people. They are warning us, if we are going to consume the energy and the raw materials like we are doing now, by then we need 3 Earths to provide what we need. That is absolutely impossible. So that's why the member states of the United Nations say we want sustainability. Without sustainable development, all of us cannot survive for too long. We will not leave promising future, sustainable future for future generations. So just a few words about the Sustainable Development Agenda. As young students with the hopes and aspirations, you may please to hear that the Secretary General of the United Nations has made working with and working for young people one of his top priorities of his second term. Putting young people so prominently on the Secretary General's agenda has never been more timely. With over 1.2 billion young people in the world, today, we are witness to the largest population of youth in the world that has never known. As young students, you are well aware of the unique challenges faced by today's youth. We urgently need to address the job crisis and respond to demands for young people's rights to be respected and their voices to be heard. It is with these concerns in mind, the Secretary General appointed a new envoy on youth, Mr. Ahmad Ahindawi from Jordan. He has been welcomed not only from United Nations member states, but by youth organizations and young people themselves. We now have additional channels through which youth voices can be heard. As a part of his action agenda, the Secretary General has initiated preparation of UN system-wide action, the Plan on Youth. Specific areas will be addressed, including employment, entrepreneurship, political inclusion, citizenship, and protection of rights, as well as education, including health education. Work on this important initiative is well underway, and over 13,000 young people from 183 countries contributed to its development via online survey. Indeed, the United Nations is working hard than ever to include the voices of young people in its work. The Secretary General also highlighted the value of youth voluntarism in announcing the establishment of United Nations Youth Volunteer Corps. Volunteerism benefits both society at large and individual development by strengthening trust, solidarity, and reciprocity among citizens. It also provides access to non-formal education. When youth have the opportunity to invest in their own societies, to become responsible partners in improving their own communities, we all benefit. More information, of course, is available on the website www.unv.org. I'm advertising United Nations. Indeed, the newly appointed envoy on youth has reiterated that not only is he an envoy for the Secretary General on youth, but he is also himself an envoy to the Secretary General. He is a messenger, bringing young people's concerns directly to His Excellency, the Secretary General. This two-way dialogue cuts to the heart of the meaningful and effective involvement of youth. In many countries across the Asia-Pacific region, youth councils have been developed and the model United Nations entities have been established to encourage participation of young people. In May 2011, the World Model United Nations was held in Singapore to enhance networking between young people. This builds capacity to help articulate their views on issues of international concern. Similar activities are regularly held in many countries across Asia and the Pacific. Without a doubt, it is crucial that young people's voices are heard, that you are part of the dialogue and you are part of the solution. Let me now turn to the issue of employment. As young students, the prospect of entering into a bleak labor market is a heavy weight on your shoulders. Globally, young people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. The impact of the past global financial crisis has significantly worsened youth vulnerabilities in the labor market. Young people account for almost half of the jobless population in Asia and the Pacific. Looking at the numbers, according to the International Labour Organization, the number of job seekers is expected to rise to more than 210 million over the next 5 years. Yes, it is not even just a question of finding employment. It is also a question of finding decent work. Across the globe, millions of young people are forced to take up work in unsafe conditions with limited rights. They often hold short-term contracts or no contracts at all, with a few benefits and little job security. These working conditions jeopardize young people's future. The chances of establishing financial security, of settling down to have families, and ultimately of prospering and living long and happy lives are at risk. We need to develop better opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship. We need to facilitate your entrepreneurs' access to the credit that they urgently needed to see their ideas come to life. Educational institutions, employers, and the governments need to work together to provide young people on-the-job training and experiences that is so crucial when looking for work. To find out from young people themselves about their challenges and their concerns. We asked young people for their views. The result of this survey, published in our 2011 World Youth Report, underscored one critical challenge: the mismatch between education and the labor market. You can learn more from our findings of this report at our website, once again, social.un.org. So I will not repeat the details set here. This brings me to the most fundamental subject, which is education. Unfortunately, in many countries, education systems are failing to teach young people the necessary skills to participate in the workplace. Moreover, too many young people are leaving education with skills that are not inadequate to the task. How to address this? Learning and curriculum development are crucial elements, as we know. And this means teacher training and teacher recruitment should be a national priority. While formal education is important in Asia, traditional apprenticeship and on-the-job training appears to be more relevant routes towards skill development among the majority of young people. In this respect, vocational education is very important for populous countries in Asia and Africa. Certainly, we have made important progress in providing education. For example, enrollment in tertiary education has grown more than fivefold over the past 4 decades. There are now some 165 million students enrolled in tertiary education, and another 530 million in secondary education. However, gaps still remain. In a number of countries, girls and young women have more limited educational opportunities than boys and young men, particularly at the secondary level. Migrants, persons with disabilities, refugees, indigenous young people all face greater challenges in acquiring an education that will provide them decent job opportunities. Around 39 million girls are missing out on secondary education. Girls from poor families, rural areas, urban slums, and ethnic and language minorities are much less likely to complete their full education cycles. Barriers to female education in Asia and the Pacific include negative attitudes towards female education in general, the burden of household work, and long journeys to school. Some 127 million youth lack basic literacy skills. They cannot read and write. 2/3 of the world's illiterate persons are women. Investing in girls' and women's education is the most important tool for eradicating poverty and for achieving social justice. Now is the time to make a concerted effort to address the very real issue of inequality in education. Education is not only a basic right for individuals, it is the basic investment for development, poverty eradication, and creative, productive, and peaceful societies. Of course, there are a variety of ways young people can actively participate, including through new ICTs and social media. By ICTs, I mean Internet communication technologies. From Twitter to Facebook, young men and young women have proven their roles as being transformative agents for changes. The increase for social media and networking platforms has primarily been driven by young entrepreneurs and users. Social media is playing a critical role in our societies, ranging from attention to political participation and institutional accountabilities, to the use of cell phones as health advisor, bank teller, weather forecaster, and many more. ICTs have also fundamental role to play when it comes to education, providing us with new opportunities to learn and find information. It also provides employment and prospects for entrepreneurship. We have been making important progress, but more work is needed. The unequal distribution of broadband infrastructure persists, which greatly limits access to ICTs, with far-reaching impacts. Let me now briefly provide you with a briefing insight into other areas of social development in which the United Nations is engaged, such as population aging, indigenous issues, and persons with disabilities. Let me start with addressing another issue that is undergoing dramatic change. That is the increasing number of older people in the global population. Back in 1980, well before many of you were born, the First World Assembly on Aging was convened. At that time, there were 378 million older persons globally. Today, some 30 years later, older persons have more than doubled in figure to 827 million. By the way, for demographic reasons, the United Nations defines older persons as 60 and older. I understand in Hong Kong, the definition of older people is 65, where you have the 三国经 By 2030, in less than 20 years, it is projected that there will be more people over 60 than children under the age of 10. You must be interested to know that more than half of the total number of older persons in the world living in Asia. So this is a rather pressing question. We are working hard to encourage governments to partner with and involve you as young people to exchange views and ideas to contribute to building societies for all. What does this mean? A society for all is where older persons can age with dignity and security, where aging is not viewed as a burden on society, where discrimination based on age is not tolerated, and where the human rights of persons, regardless how old you are equally respected. Before closing, I would like to turn to my remarks to the critical work of United Nations to enhance the lives of persons with disabilities. Since its beginning, the United Nations has been working towards the common goal of a society and a development that is inclusive of persons with disabilities. Why? Because development cannot be sustainable when 1 billion persons with disabilities, 1 out of every 7 people, including millions of young people with disabilities, live in poverty and face exclusion and multiple barriers, including discrimination. To address these challenges, in September later this year, the United Nations General Assembly will convene a high-level meeting on disability and development. This meeting will address ways to make the commitment of inclusive society and development a reality for all persons of disabilities. I count on your support to become an advocate for the change and to make the world a better for persons with disabilities. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wu, for the sharing of your words of wisdom. Mr. Wu has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. Professor Simon Shin, Director of Global Studies Program, Faculty of Social Science, will conduct the question and answer session. Professor Shin, please.
Mr. Wu, fellow colleagues and students, I'm very happy to be here. Indeed, I'm very excited as a little fan because I always want to work in the UN, but they didn't take me. So I'm so glad that I can come to learn from Mr. Wu, and I finally find the answer because I can't meet the same standard as yours, so that's why I'm here. But you have the opportunities because you're young. It's a platform for youngsters, so that's why we have this section. Originally, I have many questions, but I'm told that I should not ask any because I'm no longer young, and it's a platform for the youth and the work of the UN, so it's all yours. A few house rules. You can speak in either English or Mandarin. or even Cantonese, but that's discouraged because I have to translate. So English or Mandarin would be much better, the first one. The second is that Mr. Wu is an all-rounded person, but if you have questions not relevant to international relations, global issues, so you please do it afterwards. If you'd like to submit your CV, ask for a reference letter, you can do it later. It's not for this occasion, all right? And thirdly, please try to be very precise as possible, just like in the lectures and tutorials, all right? So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. This lady.
Hello, Mr. Wu. My name is Yi Ran. I'm a year 3 student here. Although I study business here, I'm very interested in doing volunteer work and community service. So I've worked for an American NGO in Washington, D.C. when I was a year 1 student. Because I worked there, I'm wondering, is there any fundamental difference between United Nations and other local NGOs from the perspective of humanitarian aid? Because I know there should be very many differences because United Nations can see a picture from a broader perspective, or he can help people from many different aspects. However, will there be any fundamental difference? For example, will the political issues be concerned when providing the humanitarian aid? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for raising this issue. United Nations is the largest intergovernmental organization in the world with 193 members. I think the United Nations is also the largest organization that will provide emergency aids to the people in whatever country. For instance, the United Nations provide food to North Korea, and also provide food and disaster relief aids to those who fled Syria. And in terms of the comparison with the NGOs and United Nations, I think the United Nations covers much more extensive ground. As far as the humanitarian aid is concerned, we are not make the differences whether they are politically correct or not. As long as there are people in distress, in urgent need, we will be there to help them. And I would point to one thing. There is a good relations and cooperation between United Nations and their agencies, and as well as the NGOs, because without the support of NGOs, the United Nations could not have done what they've been doing now. Thank you.
Thank you. We actually can have multiple questions, so interested colleagues or students, please raise your hand. This gentleman in the middle.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wu, thank you very much for this very insightful speech. You mentioned in your speech about the Millennium Development Goals and mentioned about the reduction of the the population living under extreme poverty. Take the globe as a whole, this goal is achieved pretty well, but I read a paper examining this problem a few months before, and this paper stated that the reduction is actually mainly contributed by the reduction in China and India, while the people living under extreme poverty actually increased in sub-Saharan Africa. So do you think that it is, after all, the national governments of the member states that really decide or have the fundamental influence on the agendas set by the United Nations? So what is the United Nations role here in coordinating different nations' activities? And a following up question may be that, personally, do you think the United Nations should evolve to some organization like the EU, which has more binding power to its member states? Because at this point, the UN has no legal binding powers to the member states of what you must do. And that's my question. Thank you.
Well, I think you are well informed. I could agree with your first part of your statement, because as we said, we have already successfully slashed the total number of people living in extreme poverty by half. Actually, we reached that the landmark, but still a lot of people. I talked to the African ministers just a few days ago. They said, globally speaking, you have achieved your millennium goal ahead of schedule, 3 years ahead of time. But as far as we are concerned, we don't see any people who have been pulled out from poverty. We actually see increasing number of poor people in our countries. However, we should recognize the fact the total number of people in extreme poverty, if you compare the figure in the year 2000 and now, or maybe next few years, 2015, has been reduced. However, there's a lot of work to do. One thing I think the United Nations is going to do is to have special high-level segment in coming September. That is mainly devoted to MDGs. The United Nations Secretary General is going to sound wake-up call to all the member states. We still have 3 years to go. The implementation of Millennium Development Goals should not lose momentum. Secondly, we have been talking about sustainable development goals, known as SDGs, that will replace MDGs as on and from 2015. There are two important bases which prop up the future SDGs. One is the continued efforts in eradicating poverty. The other is sustainability. So these two are the foundation for the future program. Well, you have been pointing to the difficulties and challenges facing the African states. These are realities. But we should look at the positive aspect of the situation. In the past few years, economic growth in Africa is higher than the developed world. Last year, the average growth is 5%. It's quite promising. So the future is difficult, but eradication of poverty must be done, not only for the poor people and for ourselves too, because we want a society with equality. We do not want to see people dying of hunger. I turn to your second question, the future of United Nations. I think most unlikely United Nations will become European Union-like. United Nations, people are complaining, too much talk, not much work you have been doing, right? Let me say a few things about United Nations, or just like promoting United Nations. First, United Nations is the largest intergovernment organization. Cannot be replaced by another country or organizations. We have 193 member states. Secondly, the United Nations actually established the norms and the principles for international behavior of countries. If you're reading the novels or official statements, you always see the phrases or sentences saying, in the spirit of UN Charter. in the spirit and the letter of UN Charter, you are violating the international laws as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Could you look around to find any other international organization who could do this? No. Thirdly, United Nations is the international organization that can take actions. Let me tell you, at this very moment, there are 120,000 peacekeepers in 16 operation areas in 4 continents. They are keeping peace on behalf of the international community. The first student who asked the question about humanitarian aid. When there's disasters or war conflict or whatever the distressed situation, United Nations will be among the first to provide aid and assistance. Last but not least, the ideas of the United Nations is influencing the world. We have mentioned some of them. MDGs, for example. SDG is gaining more important significance in the future. Now people all talk about SDGs. And inclusive society. Sustainability. These are ideas initiated by the member states in the United Nations. I think quite a few are interested to know that people are talking about GDPs. GDP as the yardstick to measure the economic strength or prosperity of a place, of a country. Nowadays, people think that is not enough. GDP is not everything. You can't have a high GDP growth, but a polluted environment. So that leads us to another question. In addition to GDP, what else we need? Now the United Nations experts, together with the other institutions, are studying what they call GDP plus. Plus what? We would like to hear your views. Thank you.
This lady, please.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a question about your own work. As the Under-Secretary General, you need to handle problems from the worldwide perspective. But as a representative of China, you need to concern the interest of China. So how do you make a balance between these two identities? Thank you.
My response to your statement, not a question. I'm amused to hear that. I think you have been asking the question that I asked myself before I was appointed Under Secretary General. You see, when you are appointed, then you will go through the procedure. You will take your oath with your hand on the UN Charter. One of the sentences that you're only loyal to the United Nations, will take no instructions from any other countries or any other institutions. So this is the necessary requirement for an international civil servant. However, I would say that as senior official of the United Nations, you are serving the interests of all the member states of the United Nations, including my country, People's Republic of China. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Professor Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. Very interesting and thought-provoking talk. Your title of the talk is Youth and the Work of the United Nations. I guess my question is Youth and the Work for the United Nations. A very direct question is, we've been advising our youngsters to just look beyond local employment, make themselves more universally employable, not just in the corporate sector, but also in the international organizations sector. Now, with Hong Kong's very special political situation, the one country, two systems, what would be your advice for our youngsters in Hong Kong if they want to become an international government civil servants and under the Chinese government's member state, the membership state? I guess this is very direct questions on trying to raise employment for our local students in Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
My answer is very, very simple. Go through the test and examinations. Because in the United Nations, we do have staff members, officials from Hong Kong. When you apply for a professional post in the United Nations, you are competing with other young people, applicants from 192 countries. They are just as talented as you are. So if you are confident you would like to join the United Nations, you're most welcome to apply for it and go through all the reviewing procedures and the examination procedures. We have no difference, because if I am the best, you'll be taken. If I'm the second best, you'll be put on the list. If I am the third best, you may pack up and go home. Thank you.
Can I still apply? Or should I go home? All right, this gentleman first.
吴先生，非常高兴听你的演讲。我想一个问题，现在呢，这个全球经济不是特别好，那么联合国的这个财政状况是不是可以维持像这些人道援助啦，还有世界维和部队啦？那么有没有一天这个联合国有这财政危机的这种可能性有没有？
我们联合国运作的费用来自于各个成员国的这个会费。成员国经济不好，我们的这个整个的预算呢也会受到影响。比如说，我们是2年这个一次这个预算，2012年到2013年算是一个这个预算单位。那么现在我们讨论2014到2015，我们在讨论的时候，联合国主动减了5%，就在预算基础上减了5%。结果让成员国讨论的时候，成员国说不够，你再减1亿美元。所以我们在讨论怎么样再减1亿美元。那么我们有 mandates， 就是我们有任务，是联合国成员国给我们的任务。你 deliver the mandates， 你必须要有资源。所以我们呢要 do more with less。当然，联合国和其他国际组织一样，钱呢，这几年是确实是紧，但是我认为，还不会到那种穷到关门的时候啊，因为联合国还是国际社会所需要的，有一些国家呢，也在逐渐的增加他们的会费的比重，比如说中国，就已经涨到了5.15%，已经是第6位，比以前交的钱更多了。这也是中国对联合国的贡献。谢谢。
All right, very simple one-line translation. The question was about the financial crisis in the UN. The one-line answer is that do more, pay less, right? All right, I'm not qualified for the translation, but so incentive for you to learn Chinese. Hans, this gentleman.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'm really curious about your earlier response about SDGs. So I want to ask, what is the current progress in the General Assembly on the conceptualization of SDGs, and how is United Nations prepared to respond to the requests of the delegations of member states on preparing a roadmap and metrics, and their concern on proposing a green economy as an ideology, especially for Latin America and Caribbean country states? Thank you.
SDG is really a great challenge, not only for United Nations, but to the international community. Some of you may know, in the old days, back in the year 2000, it were a number of experts drawing up the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, behind closed doors. Then they presented to the General Assembly and the summit for deliberation, and they passed it. But this time is absolutely different, because Sustainable Development Agenda or Sustainable Development Goals will be applicable to all the countries, developing and developed alike. So we have taken a different process, inclusive, transparent, and open, which means all the countries will be consulted, all the stakeholders, including NGOs, civil society, and the medias, and even people on the street have been invited to have their input. So far, so good. But when you collect all income back home, you have a Christmas tree with all the goodies on the trees. You cannot concentrate your efforts and your resources on so many areas. You have to condense it. But this is up to the member states to decide. We gave them advice. They agreed. Limited in numbers. For instance, 10 or less than 10. Another question is coming. For instance, when we say food, it's difficult to choose one goal for United States of America, China, and say Mali, because they have very different situations. Overnourished people on the streets in the United States, food security problems in China, unbalanced nutrition, and people dying on the street in Mali. So we envisage there should be a cluster of goals tailored to different countries with different situations. That is very difficult, but we have to do it. I think that with the collective wisdom, we will reach our goals. This is not a new subject. It has been discussed for years. I think all the member states know the subjects and the concept. Now they're trying to produce a set of specific goals that will be accepted and to be implemented by all the countries. Thank you.
I know we all have many questions, but since time is limited, I think we'll have to jump to the final one. All right, this gentleman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wu. As the Under-Secretary General in United Nations, do you think that cultural diversity will bring a huge of negative effects on the operation in United Nations? Will the cultural conflicts occur very frequently in United Nations, and how can you deal with it? Thank you.
I said to myself, when you become Under Secretary General of the United Nations, under your leadership, there are a lot of people of different nationalities. You have people from the United States, from India, Pakistan, France, Italy, and from Latin America. They all have different culture background, but they are extremely professional. In my department, we have over 500 people. Most of them with the doctor degrees or even postdoctorate degrees. There was a joke that somebody from school with a doctor degree, fresh from school, and he was showing his card to the name card to everybody. I'm the doctor. And 3 days later, he found out the people they are talking about are professors from university. You see, the best talents, I'm proud to say, in my department. And there are cultural differences, but I think that is good. Because in some countries, people are very straightforward. And some people from other countries may be very polite. But you're trying to feel out that he wants to say something. But we work as a very good team. The only thing is that respect. As a leader, you should have a full respect for your colleagues. In case of problems, you will take responsibility for them because you are the manager. Full trust for your subordinates. I think the Chinese culture does help because we do not go to extremes. Some say we go the middle way, right? Just like riding a bicycle. If you can't keep in the middle, you will fall. What I can say is, irrespective of the different culture differences, I have been on very good terms with all my colleagues from different countries. We are happy together, and we have been working as a team, deliver as a team. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Wu. I think we have all learned so much. From today onwards, go to the UN website, submit the application form. I hope 20 years later, you'll be sitting here instead of here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wu and Professor Shen. Would Mr. Wu please remain on stage, and Professor Shen, please take a seat at the audience. It is indeed our great honor to have invited Mr. Wu to the Chinese University of Hong Kong. To show our appreciation, may I invite our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Fok Tai Fai, to present a souvenir to Mr. Wu. Gentlemen, please. Thank you, Mr. Wu and Professor Fok. Please remain on stage for some group photos.
On behalf of United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, congratulations on the 50th anniversary of the university. Thank you.